What is an MMO without the Holy Trinity? No tank, no DPS, no healer. For that matter, what is an MMO without side quests? And, more importantly, what is it like to have a decade's worth of content thrown at you all at once with no enforced structure on how you should engage with it? In this video, we're going to answer these questions and perhaps figure out once and for all if there is such a thing as too much player freedom. Greetings, I'm Rein, and this is Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 belongs to the ranks of the tab targeting MMO, and is one of the few where you can actually dodge most enemy attacks as opposed to being hit halfway across the map just because an enemy is aggroed onto you. As stated in the intro, there is no traditional trinity in Guild Wars 2. Instead, each class has its own damage mitigation and healing skills, with the focus instead on making every class play completely different from the others. It isn't a stretch to say that any given class in Guild Wars 2 is playing a completely different game. Now that we know what kind of game we're dealing with, let's take a brief look at the game's history. Released in 2012, Guild Wars 2 is the sequel to one of my favorite MMOs of all time, which is Guild Wars in case that wasn't obvious. For the first 10 years of its life, Guild Wars 2 was only purchasable from the ArenaNet site and playable through their own client, until it went free to play and released on Steam in 2022. As of recording this video, there are currently 4 expansions, with a 5th on the way in August of this year, in addition to several seasons of content known as the Living World, which serves to bridge the gap between expansions not just in terms of giving players something to do, but literally advancing the series' timeline. The world of Guild Wars is alive in a sense. Time passes as the story progresses, with the base game and the first 3 DLCs, known collectively as the Elder Dragon Saga, accounting for nearly a full decade of in-game time. So there's quite a bit of content for a new player to sink their teeth into. However, as is often the case for these older games, the older content is generally not updated to the standard of more recent releases. My goal with this video is to see what Guild Wars 2 is like in 2024, from the perspective of a brand new player. As such, this video will only cover the core game. That is the content from character creation to defeating the undead Elder Dragon Zhaitan at the end of the core campaign. There will be a second video released in the future covering the remainder of the Elder Dragon saga, but for now we only need concern ourselves with the quest to rid Tyria of the Risen, and whatever the hell Destiny's Edge we're getting up to while the Pact Commander was getting shit done. Before we delve into character creation, I feel it's important to discuss the various account types in Guild Wars 2. You see, the game was originally a paid product. However, as of now, the core game is free. What this means is that someone who downloads the game right now off Steam without purchasing any additional content will have far more restrictions on what they can do in the game, when compared to someone who bought the base game a decade ago. But what kind of restrictions are we talking about? Free accounts have less character slots than paid accounts, as well as less inventory slots. They also can't utilize the gold to gems currency conversion to obtain premium currency by farming gold. However, all of the actual content in the core game, which this video will discuss, is available despite these restrictions. And really, the only restriction that actually hurts is the storage situation. But I feel like what is available to a free player is quite substantial when compared to free accounts or trials offered by other MMOs, with exception to Final Fantasy XIV. However, should a free player enjoy the game and have the desire to upgrade to a paid account, this can easily be accomplished by purchasing any expansion. My recommendation in this situation would be to pick up the Path of Fire expansion, as it also grants access to the first expansion, Heart of Thorns. With that out of the way, we can move on to the fun part, character creation. Guild Wars 2 offers a selection of 5 races for players to choose from when creating a new character. No races have been added since the game launched, so what you see is what you get. These races include the cat-like Char, once mortal enemies of mankind back in the original game, the standard human, the Viking-inspired Norn, the diminutive Asura, and the mysterious Sylvari. As is the case with most MMOs, the race and gender of your character does not matter. They're entirely cosmetic. Character creation in Guild Wars 2 is actually fairly robust, considering it comes from a time when most MMOs only offered you a selection of 3 or 4 hairstyles and maybe a handful of different eyes. Here you can see a few of the options I was able to choose for my Norn, which I chose because I like tall women with big asses. More important, however, are the choices you make near the end of character creation. You will be prompted to respond to various multiple choice questions. Your answers will actually influence a part of the early storyline, with different events playing out prior to your selection of an order. For my character, the options I selected led to me being lent out to a Char warband whose vehicle I'd lost while blackout drunk prior to the game beginning. It's very interesting, and I don't think I've seen anything quite like this in any other MMO. This kind of feature is usually reserved for single-player console RPGs such as Dragon Age. With our hero created, I think it's finally time to take our first steps into Tyria. Upon entering the game world for the very first time, I was greeted with no less than 5 trillion pop-ups telling me about every single piece of content included with the bundle I had purchased. Now, this normally wouldn't be a problem. However, this was my first experience with the game's UI, and each of these notifications created a brand new icon on my HUD, which I was still unfamiliar with. So this did throw me for a loop at least for a few seconds. I think that perhaps these could have shown up when I was actually at the level the relevant content unlocks at, as most of these very clearly said I wouldn't be able to access them until level 80. This is, however, an ultimately minor inconvenience if you would even call it that. Now, each race has their own starting zone. As I chose to play as a Norn, I was greeted with the boreal forest of the Shiver Peaks upon entering Tyria. Don't think too hard about which race you choose, as you'll end up going through every race's starting zone throughout the main campaign anyway, although it may be worth it to make multiple characters in the future to experience those stories. The Norn questline, having previously been affected by my selections during character creation, saw me charged with several tasks in order to build my prestige to gain the notice of my racial mentor, Erstigalkin, and gain admission to the Great Hunt, wherein I would be tasked with challenging the captured ice worm Isormir to further my own glory. The story at this point was somewhat interesting, however, it is here that the unique nature of Guild Wars 2's questing, or lack thereof, comes into question. You see, the main story of the core game is referred to as your personal story, and you get a new set of quests every 10 levels. However, there are no side quests in this game, so if you come up short a few levels, you're stuck collecting points of interest, scanning vistas, or doing renown hearts. Now, this might not sound terrible at first, but things like renown hearts get old very quickly. I found myself just not wanting to bother with most of them as they weren't particularly interesting. This did lead to me wandering around and encountering the odd dynamic event in my starting area, which we'll get into later, but largely it wasn't a great experience. This, combined with how lackluster early game combat can be when you don't have many weapons to try out because for some reason, the game keeps giving you the same weapon type as rewards, and most of your kit is locked behind hero points that are slowly doled out via level up unless you want to seek out the hero challenges on the map. Please don't take this as me bashing the game, because if I didn't enjoy it enough to persevere through this dull part, I wouldn't be making this video to begin with. I don't think it's really fair to judge an MMO by the quality of the early game experience, as everyone knows the cool stuff doesn't come until mid-game or later. Fortunately, things did ramp up fairly quickly. So we've talked about the early gameplay, but we should also go over your various stats. There are good and bad ways to explain stats to players. Guild Wars 2 chooses to avoid this issue entirely by never explaining what any of these words mean or what they really affect. For instance, power influences the damage you do. Not just your physical attacks, but literally any skill performed using that weapon, which includes a necromancer's spells for some reason. However, this can be forgiven. What cannot be forgiven is that the game never explains that the toughness stat not only affects your defense, but also how much aggro you accumulate. That seems somewhat important for players to know, but I'm not a game designer, so what do I know, right? Overall, I don't think hiding information from new players in a game that is already not really among the most popular of its genre is a great idea. But a quick mouse over in your inventory screen will tell you everything you need to know. Except for the toughness aggro thing, it doesn't say that for some reason. Another thing the game doesn't really explain is why all these orange circles keep popping up on your map. Granted, you could figure out the skull icon is a boss of sorts if you happen to go near one and see a giant enemy has spawned, but these also also show you the location of the aforementioned dynamic events. In my journey through the core game, I came across 2 such events near my starting zone. The first was this large-scale, almost raid-like fight against a corrupted Sons of Svanir Norn. This event showed me that there are still quite a few players in Guild Wars 2, as the amount of people present and the skills going off during that fight nearly turned my game into a slideshow. The second event I encountered is one that I actually figured out how to trigger, and ended up doing a few times. You just have to do a few quests in this Ice Dome area until the big boss shows up. It's kind of neat. Your racial story effectively ends after the first set of quests, leading into your Order storyline. After a certain point, you'll be prompted to join up with one of the 3 major orders of Tyria, which are devoted to fighting against the Elder Dragons, each in their own way. For my part, I chose the Order of Whispers, because Ifwin is super hot, although you literally never see her again after this, unless she shows up in an expansion. From that point on, you will be doing errands for your Order, which will eventually lead you to your first major city, Lion's Arch. Here, you will meet your Order mentor and get to know them for roughly 2 quest lines before they fucking die in a zombie invasion. However, it's more hilarious than sad. But I get what the devs were going for, it just really didn't land. Do note, however, that the title of this chapter is not hyperbole. Your Order choice, quite literally, does not matter. Once you meet up with Traherne, you essentially get conscripted into his new organization and become his second in command, completely severing your ties with your old Order, although you do get the option to work with them again near the end of the core campaign. Also, having to aim cannons in this game is dog shit, and I'm glad I never had to do it again. Guild Wars 2 is interesting in regards to leveling. Specifically, the level cap has not changed since the game released. Essentially, you hit level 80 and then all of your EXP goes into Mastery, which I'm not sure what that's about. What this means is that once you cap, it's basically a straight shot to the end of the game. So let's take a look at what that's like. I would like to briefly mention that I did the entirety of the base game solo, including the final dungeon and battle with the Elder Dragon Zaitan. This is something that I regret immensely for reasons you will come to understand shortly. I genuinely feel that this content should be done in a group, and that is how I recommend you to engage with it should you choose to pick up Guild Wars 2. The battle with Zaitan is both one of the most spectacular things I've seen in an MMO, and also one of the most lackluster fights I've ever had the displeasure of doing. At the start of the fight, you finally get to see this undead menace you've been chasing for the last 30 hours, and he looks amazing. The downside is that you don't actually get to fight him. What follows his introduction is essentially a 20-minute sequence of you smashing the interact key on the same cannon over and over until his HP is depleted, while he occasionally sends minions or AoEs to discourage you. You can see why I think this would have been better in a group, so I will admit that my disappointment in this fight is likely entirely down to my refusal to group up, in the interest of completing the campaign more expeditiously. I do appreciate the scale and sense of awe the devs were likely going for with this fight. However, I still would have liked to engage the Elder Dragon in person rather than via airship cannon. I know the 3 expansions I still have to work through involve confronting the remaining Elder Dragons, so I can only hope that this issue was rectified at some point in one of those. Now, what unlocks after you finish the core campaign? Well, that would be the living world that I mentioned previously. These are story chapters that serve to bridge the gap between expansions. There are 2 between the core game and the first expansion. I have yet to do them as of recording this video, but they will be included in the follow-up to this video. In addition to story content, you gain access to your elite specializations. Unlike the core specs, which you can make use of while playing through the campaign, these specializations completely change how your class plays. This includes new mechanics, as well as unlocking new weapon types for you to use. For example, the Necromancer's Reaper Elite specialization grants the use of greatswords. Overall, I enjoyed my experience in Tyria quite a bit, and I'm eager to go back in to experience the expansion content. I will be changing my approach for the second Guild Wars 2 video by playing with others as much as I can, however. For all the things I think this game does right, there are plenty of things I didn't enjoy as much. Let's just run through both sides briefly. As far as things I feel Guild Wars 2 excels at, I would definitely put the Trinity-less class system they've got going at the top. It's definitely an interesting experience being able to heal and mitigate damage without relying on dedicated healers healers or tanks. However, I would have liked to maybe be able to move my abilities around on the hotbar. As it stands, every skill type has its own slot. Granted, I could just rebind my skills to whatever keys I want, but muscle memory demands that I have every skill in order due to the way I bind my actions in pretty much every MMO I play. Secondarily, I really like the Vista mechanic, if you can call it a mechanic, which rewards the player for exploring the map thoroughly. There are certainly things I wouldn't have paid attention to or even come across if those red triangles weren't on my map. For example, in one zone I came across an entire broken down mech and had to jump onto its wreckage to access the Vista point. This sort of thing does exist in Final Fantasy XIV, but it's mostly just a personal thing there, as it's not tied to map completion the way it is in Guild Wars 2. The story, I feel, also has the potential to be a strong aspect of the game. While I was certainly invested in the latter half of the story, the first half was significantly weaker, although I do expect the quality to increase as I go through the expansion content. We'll just have to wait and see if my opinion changes in the near future. What I think is one of the strongest features of the game is the ability to exchange in-game currency for premium currency, even though there are things you just can't buy with gems, such as expansions or living world seasons. The economy in Guild Wars 2 essentially means you can farm out any cosmetic you want and all it would cost is your time. Meanwhile, if you wanted to cut down on farming and just buy the gear you need, you can also exchange gems for gold to spend on the in-game market board. I think that this is a fantastic feature which I already have made extensive use of in Warframe, which has a similar setup. As far as cons go, I would say the only things that really stand out are the inability to simply click a point on the map and create a waypoint. There is a button combination you can press to do that, but I don't understand why I need to hold down two keys and then click when I could simply just click. That's just a minor gripe though. I also feel that the stamina system is incredibly limiting, perhaps too much so. While I do like the pseudo action combat, there were many times when I simply died because stamina takes such a long time to recover while in combat, so I wasn't able to roll out of the way many times, such as against the Mouth of Zaitan boss in the final dungeon. I think this could be mitigated by a gear stat. Perhaps there's an item or accessory that I simply missed that increases stamina, but also a simple universal sprint such as the one in Final Fantasy XIV would also be a welcome addition, but I doubt such a thing would be added this late into the game's lifespan. My final complaint is ultimately a nitpick, but I feel like some menus are cumbersome at best and often obtuse to navigate. The hero screen is a series of drop-down menus which I'm not really a fan of. It works and you get used to it after a while, but I just feel like some of these could have been their own menu. Ultimately, the question is, would I recommend Guild Wars 2 to new players in 2024? The answer is a resounding yes. My minor issues aside, this game has aged remarkably well considering it's not really a game one thinks of when talking about the best MMOs. There's a lot of content to go through even for a completely free player, and more is being added regularly. In addition to the 3 expansions I've purchased, there is a 4th which starts a new saga, the 2nd expansion of which is coming in August along with a player housing feature, which I'm very interested in. I feel I would be doing my viewers a disservice if I didn't at least take a look at the microtransactions on offer in Guild Wars 2. Fortunately, the vast majority of MTX in this game are cosmetics such as character skins, mount skins, and dyes, so as far as MMO cash shops go, this one isn't particularly offensive. However, in Guild Wars 2, you are severely limited in your bank storage. You can buy additional slots for gems. The same is true for additional inventory space for your character. Now, while bank slots are account-wide, inventory slots are per character, which seems almost insane to me, but whatever. From what I've read, the existing community doesn't really see an issue with the system, as Guild Wars 2 allows you to exchange the in-game gold currency for gems which function identically to gems you would pay for. So really, there's nothing you can't obtain unless you are a free account, in which case you cannot make use of the exchange feature at all, likely to prevent gold bots. I do want to give a shout out to the mount skins specifically, because some of these are really sick, and if I end up playing this game long term, I will probably own most of them by year's end, unfortunately. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Guild Wars 2. As I've said previously, there will be a follow-up video in the near future. However, the next video will be covering the recently released looter shooter, The First Ascendant, where we will be comparing it to its competitors such as Destiny 2 and Warframe. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really does help a lot. I would also like to take this time to remind viewers that I am now streaming on this channel, and as such, weekly streaming schedules can be found in the community tab every Monday. If you're interested in watching as I gather footage for new videos, feel free to drop by and say hello. As always, I've been Rein, and we will meet again, perhaps sooner than you think.